Hello, I'm Kamla. My guest today is Pete Nix. His film, The Force, won an award at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival. We're going to be talking to him about his film, the making of his film, and why he makes films, because he is the chief storyteller and founder of Open Hood, based in Oakland. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I love the name Open Hood.
I do too.
How did you come up with it?
I came up with it because of this notion of, we live in a nation now where we're siloed, where we are in our bubbles, and that we need to learn and listen to each other. And storytelling is one of the best ways that you can develop and improve empathy amongst community. And so that was the first impetus for it. And the second idea was to that we're at a moment in time where understanding how our institutions are working in our communities, our healthcare systems, our public education systems, our criminal justice system is really vital towards making decisions as a democracy. And so those reasons really led to the creation of the nonprofit and the making of our films.
What are some of the earliest stories you remember from your childhood?
I come from a big family. My mom's one of 10, and so we would have family reunions, and we would have huge numbers. I've got so many cousins, and my Uncle Ray had a video camera, and he would sort of go around. And I remember I at a young age, I sort of was the one who took the microphone and would interview members of my family. I think that was
So you were
really,
the chief storyteller for your family.
Kind of. That was really when the spark, was set for me, and just this notion of, even within a family where you think you sort of know people, that if you stop for a moment and ask someone simple questions, that so much can be revealed, and so that notion of discovery really became the foundation for my exploration as a storyteller and later as a filmmaker.
Is that why you majored in English at Howard University?
I majored in English because originally I wanted to be a writer. And some of my earliest work at Howard was actually around my family, trying to sort of reflect my experiences and what I observed in my family. And from there, I had actually had to pick a minor, so I picked journalism as a minor, and I had to do a senior project. And for some reason, I had done an internship at this little organization called the Hispanic Link News Service, which was telling the stories of Hispanics in America. Nobody else was really doing it. So it was
like a wire service.
Yeah, but nobody else was doing it, and it was kind of a hole-in-the-wall thing, and it was a white guy who had married this woman from Oaxaca, and Charlie Erickson, and it just became syndicated all over the country.
So he was very driven by passion.
Yeah, nobody else was serving that community nationwide, and so this little tiny news service in Washington, D.C. became syndicated all over the country, and I found the love story interesting between Charlie and his wife, and I found the issue of the voice of Latinos in America, which this little news service was serving, to be fascinating. So I made a little documentary about it. It's my senior project, and that was really when my passion began for nonfiction, for sort of documentary storytelling. And then I heard that John Ellis was joining the faculty at Berkeley, and I went from Howard to Berkeley to study documentary film.
But there was a gap between Howard and Berkeley.
There was a gap, not between graduation and Berkeley. I went right from it, but I did take off several years when I was at Howard because I got in trouble and actually went away to federal prison at the height of the war on drugs. Got sucked into drugs, got addicted to cocaine, got wrapped up in a scheme with a friend of mine in D.C. and got arrested and went to prison for a year, federal prison. So I made, my first documentary was actually about my addiction and the impact that it had on my family and friends.
How did that change you?
Really, when you tell your own story and then you engage really close loved ones of yours, friends and family who experienced that along with me that I had never really talked to about sort of what happened to me, it makes you realize the sort of power and impact of that process of not just me telling the story, but it's so personal. Like when you go into someone's life as a filmmaker or a storyteller, you're having a tremendous impact on them. And so it gave me a really deep understanding of, from the other side, the responsibility that you have as a storyteller in telling someone else's story. So I felt that in starting with my own story, it would give me some insight into that responsibility.
What's that film called? Is it available?
Well, it was originally called The Wolf, and it was produced out of, right after I graduated from Berkeley. John Else, who was my mentor and who I studied with at Berkeley, became frustrated with the process of trying to fund documentaries, how you had to submit all these applications. And, he had been nominated for an Academy Award for The Day After Trinity, and he was a very well-known, well-respected filmmaker, but he still had to submit 100 plus applications for a film, and he became frustrated by that. And so he started a center funded by the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation to support individuals, to support artists and not proposals. And the notion was to give artists a set amount of money, and they wouldn't have to submit a proposal, and they could do whatever they want. So and to support artists at different levels of their career.
But how do they figure out which artist to assign the money to? So
I offered to help him to sort of get the center off the ground and to help facilitate the management of it, and then I guess he repaid me by making me one of the inaugural filmmakers. So it was myself, who was the sort of entry-level filmmaker, Lourdes Portillo, who was a local sort of Bay Area filmmaker, and then at the time Albert Maisels, who has since passed away, but his film, which is about sort of trains, just recently came out. That was funded through the center. So that process was really, of making that film was the beginning of my career.
Can I quickly go back to what you mentioned, that you spent a year in federal prison?
Mm-hmm.
Who helped you? Because when you come out of such a raw experience,
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy,
Mm-hmm.
Who helped you? And if somebody else has been through that experience, what would you tell them they should do? Because you have to rebuild yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's a profound question, and it's part of the sort of intellectual inquiry that I'm going through, with not only with my own story, but what it means to all the people I've met along the way. I've met, I'm African American. I grew up in an African American household. I'm mixed race. I was adopted in 1968. My birth mother.
Mixed race. Do you know what mixed?
My birth mother is white, and my birth father is African American, and they met in Cleveland in 1968, and her family. This was a time when race. It's hard to say that it was worse than it is now, because we're having such a struggle with it now. But it was worse in a different way, and I think in families, particularly with interracial relationships, there was a lot of tension and disagreement over the acceptance of that, and that led to sort of her giving me up for adoption, and then I was adopted by a black family and sort of grew up outside of Boston and ended up going to Howard. And so, my mom was a school teacher. My dad worked for the federal government. He's a clinical psychologist. So I had lots of opportunities. We weren't necessarily wealthy, but they found ways they got me to summer camp and got me a scholarship. They got me to a private school outside of Boston. And so I carried with me through my troubles, once I got into trouble, their support, their love, the narrative of success that sort of surrounded me. All of my friends were on their way to graduate school or law school or medical school. And when I got to prison, I was meeting a lot of young black men just like myself, but who had none of that sort of backdrop, who didn't carry the internal narrative. And I talk about that internal narrative because I really believe it's one of the most important keys to my ability to kind of turn it around, because it was very
that helped
bleak.
you.
Yeah, because it was very sort of bleak prospects coming out of prison, having a felony conviction on your record, trying to conceptualize the rest of your life and take the steps necessary to rebuild your life. You need to have confidence that it's worth it.
And empathy.
And
how do you judge people today?
And people need to have empathy for you. And what I discovered very quickly was that part of it was maybe because of how I speak or how I carry myself, how I dress, but people wanted to be part of my recovery. People wanted to be part of my recovery.
Because they recognized that was not you.
Culturally, maybe the people that I was interacting with, trying to get opportunities from, there was a familiarity there culturally. You know, I went to private schools. I went to Howard University. Whereas a lot of the guys I was locked up with, you know, they're going to get out and they're not going to have that connection to people. People aren't going to have that comfort level.
So it's
with
like
them.
what we see in The Wire.
Yeah, yeah. And I was locked up with a lot of the guys in the Wire that I spent time locked up with, and in recovery and rehabs with, and NA meetings, you know, in DC, and a lot of recidivism. A lot of these guys end up getting out with great intentions, but without the supportive networks, without the things that I had that allowed me to bounce back.
How did your father help you?
It wasn't just my father. It was
Because he was a psychologist, you know, so he would have had. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think different people in my family helped in different ways. And, you know, my father had a very distinct personality, and his narrative was very different than my mom's. My mom's parents came from the coast of West Africa and grew up outside of Boston, but faced less racism because they were almost European. You know, the Cape Verdeans were perceived a little bit differently. Whereas my dad came from the South, and you know, my name, you know, Nix, N-I-C-K-S, was a slave name, and when the slaves,
it?
Yeah, N-I-X, and when the slaves were freed, as many freed slave families would do, the name was changed. And you know, he he was the first in his family to pursue higher degree, got his PhD. He went to school with Martin Luther King. He faced extreme racism as a striver, as a young African American striver, you know, in the 40s and early 50s. And so he was really sort of damaged by that, and I didn't realize until much later, after he died, really, and he passed away in 2005. And we didn't understand the depth of those narratives until much later, and that's another thing that spoke to me in terms of the importance of telling your story, of getting these difficult stories out there, because we're never as alone as we think we are, you know. And so, but he was always incredibly supportive, and he was a role model for me. I always sort of looked up to him. You know, he has his PhD. He was well respected, and I don't even think I fully understood how well respected he was until after he passed away. And we actually at his funeral, so many people coming up to me, talking about how the impact that he had on their lives was really, really profound for me. So,
how did you find the courage to embrace what you did and underwent? Because that requires courage. It requires courage to talk about it openly, because we are all quick to make decisions. We're all quick to slot you. Yeah. It's human nature, you know, to slot people.
I became very, when I was in prison, it just stuck out to me in terms of the significance of seeing these young men who were just like me, you know, whose story may not be told, or who didn't have the support that I had, and I became kind of committed at that moment to sort of make sense of these two parallel journeys, my journey and the sort of diversity of what is the African American experience. You have, you know, people who come from underprivileged communities. You have people who come from privilege. You have a spectrum, you know. And when I was at Howard, you kind of saw that spectrum, and I think it was a combination of both being at Howard and then also finding myself wrapped up in the criminal justice system that got me interested in sort of breaking down stereotypes and sort of reframing people's perceptions of who's an African American, you know, who are the uninsured, you know, who is a cop.
So you got to see the other side, which you had probably not seen much of.
No.
Because you grew up in a middle class neighborhood.
Yes, and even Howard. I mean, at Howard there were cohorts from you know, the inner city or from communities that were underprivileged, but these were all sort of strivers, people within those communities who were striving. And when I got to prison, I saw sort of the consequences of a lack of access to education, lack of access to health care, the impacts of the criminal justice system disproportionately on African Americans who are being incarcerated at rates a lot higher than their representation in society. And we just saw this report come out in the New York Times about the disparities amongst African Americans and Hispanics still to this day in the education system. So these are all things that kind of, you know, people talk about being woke now, but these things kind of woke me up at a relatively young age, just as I was coming of age, because I was very young when this happened. I was 21 years old when this happened, and so it really became sort of the foundation.
So that explains why you are making this trilogy in some ways, because you have an impetus, because you have experienced some of it, and you know the importance of good health care, you know the importance of a good education, and you know the importance of having a good police force that can help, because people slip, and a good cop can actually help you back on your feet. So I guess there's an internal driver that's propelling you to do the trilogy. Is that a right way to frame it?
Yeah, I think it's very personal in some ways, and but I also recognize that people's experience is very personal. So while for me, I never had too many incidents. My dad did, of sort of being treated by the police in certain ways. My interactions with the police,
even with his education.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
This was in Massachusetts or in
no,
South?
he grew up in the South.
Okay.
And then in Philadelphia when he was a little bit older. But I think there's still the implicit bias, the racism. I mean, I'm a lighter skinned. He's darker skinned. A lot of those realities are what sort of struck me when I met these other young men in prison, some of them who were incredibly bright. And I just thought to myself, if their story could be told, if we could sort of try to reframe how people see convicts or drug addicts, because who was sitting right next to the crack dealers from Philly and DC is these white con men and junk bond, traders and white collar criminals. These were all people who had transgressed the law just the same, who were right there in the same place.
But they were treated differently?
Well, I think society in general treats them differently. I mean,
so the color of your skin informs?
Well, I think this...
Or your station in life, what informs you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the vast majority of sort of white-collar criminals will pass through the criminal justice system, do their time, get out, and go right back to it. Go back to their lives, go back to their bank accounts, whereas a lot of these young, men who come out of, so a lot of these drug crimes in particular have nothing to go back to because they didn't come from anything. So I think that speaks to sort of how we sort of criminalize certain members of society, and speaks to questions about our sort of value system around that. And really ultimately sort of stereotypes about who's, we can criticize Michael Milken or what was her name, Martha Stewart. But at the end of the day, they have their lives.
You've actually forgotten.
Yeah, sure.
That they went to.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Before we talk about your film, I want to ask about The Wire, because I don't know, but maybe it is the first time that such a TV series was made, which takes you behind and shows you how the police force works, how they work with the community, the drug dealers, the government, the bureaucrats, the port authorities.
Yep.
It's the whole 360. It's everything, underneath the surface. They're all interconnected. So it's not told just from one organization's perspective.
Yep.
It's interconnected. You see how the prison guard actually is dealing in drugs, and he brings this tainted drug where probably it was planted by one of the drug dealers. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How much of influence did that series have on you?
The Wire had a huge impact on me because for the first time I felt like an authenticity sort of in storytelling, and a sort of commitment to, David Simon spent years
12 years or something. Yeah.
Writing about and traversing the streets of Baltimore before that series could be fully formed and conceived, and sort of that deep internalization that he was able to sort of render out from that, a television series talking about humanity, and sort of breaking down our preconceptions and our stereotypes, I thought was brilliant. And it also spoke to how we're all more similar and connected than we realize, and kind of going after some of the contradictions and hypocrisies about roles, and about sort of, whether it's the posturing that a politician would make, or a cop, or even a drug dealer, someone who presents themselves as hard because they have to actually has vulnerabilities that speak to their humanity. And I think the show was able to reveal not only some of the vulnerabilities of some of those that we stereotype in a negative way, but also sort of take to task some of the people who present in a way that with a moral authority that can be actually deconstructed and taken apart. You know, that you're presenting yourself in a way that you think you're righteous, but actually you're not that much different than this person over here that you perceive as the bad guy. You know, so this notion of good guys and bad guys and humanity.
It's very fuzzy.
Fascinating, and I think that that's the truth in life. You know, I think when you start unpacking institutions, you have to inevitably get to the individual, to the people who populate those institutions, and that's what that series did so well, is in a very intimate way zoomed into the character.
So were you hooked to it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was probably one of the first shows that I kind of watched. I mean, there were shows that I grew up watching. You know, there's Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere and things like that, but this one had a spark to it and a truth to it that wasn't overt and like hammered you over the head with it, but that just sort of drew you in. And I don't feel like I had, you know, fully experienced that before.
So The Wire influenced you quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Did you rewatch it?
A little bit, actually, yeah, when we were making The Force.
Yeah.
A little bit, but I don't actually like to sort of try not to get influenced by other things because I want
We're only humans.
Yeah, and you know, part of my process of storytelling is a sort of genuine discovery of, you know, what's in front of me and what am I seeing here, and trying to make sense of it. And we do the similar things with our work, is we tend to spend a lot of time in an environment prior to actually shooting the film, with the waiting room. It was a good year or two of research and conversations before we began making the film. With the Force, it was about a year of sort of work trying to get access to the department. But we watched some of Frederick Wiseman's work, looking at institutions. We looked at Alan and Susan Raymond's films. There's been a number of films.
So you did your literature review?
A little bit, and you know, we kind of were familiar. I was already familiar about the genre, sort of just from being around and going through graduate school studying documentary. But we felt, you know, this was as much a story about this moment in time as it was a genre film. That you know, many police stories have been told, but we were in a very particular moment in time when you know, Black Lives Matter was rising, and this police department was being tasked with reform, that we felt we had an opportunity to take the audience into that process and try to understand what it meant.
Let's take a quick look at the trailer of the film and then come back and talk about The Force.
Sure.
So here's a clip from the film The Force, which is about the Oakland Police Department and the community of Oakland.
One police officer can affect the credibility of a department, of a city. One police officer can have an impact on this whole country.
This police department has a history that we have to own up to. It's our legacy. I don't want bad cops here, period. I don't need them. They can go.
Is the Force shooting in 2 months by the Oakland Police Department of black men?
We don't know the story. Don't nobody know the story. What happened? What's going on?
Patriotism, 1922.
Panicking under public pressure will get you dead. You get one chance to get it right.
The reason I asked about The Wire is when I saw The Force, and I was talking to my husband, and he said, I wonder if it was influenced by The Wire. I said, that's a good question. And so that's why I thought maybe you were influenced by The Wire, because it has that punch, The Force, you know? So you came up with the second of your trilogy, the Oakland Police Department. Very interesting film. And you had to wrap it up at a very interesting point in the history of Oakland.
Yeah.
Why does Oakland have such a bad rap?
Well, I think a lot of the story of Oakland tends to get, delivered to broader audiences via the media and now social media, and that tends to sort of flatten things out into a more two-dimensional narrative just because there isn't enough time, in a news report or a headline or a news story to sort of unpack the complexity of a city like Oakland the way that The Wire unpacked the complexity of Baltimore. And, the old adage, it bleeds, it leads, kind of drives the content, and then people, of course, consume that, and that inflects their view of the city. And so I think for many years, Oakland was kind of packaged in that way. There wasn't as much sort of going on in terms of, entrepreneurial activity or growth. And so Oakland became kind of the sum of its parts, And now that Oakland is growing, which obviously has brought new problems with it, there's a lot more to tell, about the city. Not that there wasn't before, it's just you had to make more of a commitment to sort of going in and getting deeper with a community, with individuals within that community to tell that story. That's what we did with the waiting room, the notion of sitting in a waiting room, and we just asked people, we did a storytelling project before we made the film where we just asked people, what are you waiting for? And that simple question yielded profound moments of expression, and we filmed hundreds of these interviews and put them online. They're on our website.
So that was about the healthcare system in Oakland, and now this is about the police.
Yeah.
The Oakland Police Department was founded in the 1850s, so it's got a long history.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I think for the last 15 years or so, it has been under some sort of a federal monitoring system.
Yes.
And when you started, your film was filmed over a period of 2 years, and that was a time when it looked like the police department would turn around, and then things went horribly wrong.
Yeah, well, they were close to satisfying the requirements of the federal, the negotiated settlement agreement, which was a court order that came as a result of a civil rights case in 2000, the Riders case, which led to the court oversight. And when we began filming, they had hired Chief Sean Went, and they had had a succession of chiefs before that, which weren't quite able to close the deal on the requirements of the reform for a variety of complicated reasons, and Sean Went was brought in to close that deal, and he was very close to actually achieving that. In that year and a half to 2 years that we filmed, we saw and we captured quite a bit of progress that the department was getting a lot of credit for, and they were kind of known nationwide as one of the more progressive police departments. And we were just about done with the film, which was in some ways a complicated film because it wasn't revealing all the things that people necessarily felt should be revealed about a police department. In other words, what are you hiding? What are they hiding from you? And we were internally debating that and wondering if this was going to be a problem if we were showing a film, showing a department reforming, would the community be able to hold that truth? Was it the truth? Even we kind of wondered, And we were at the final stages of editing that film when, this scandal that became a sort of international scandal erupted at the OPD, and so we had to, make some pretty difficult decisions about
Did you have to re-edit?
Oh yeah, we had to change the whole film. So we had to figure out how to incorporate. At one point we thought maybe we won't include it in the film, maybe we'll make a separate film, but we were running out of money. The funders were very, gracious to give us the resources to make this film, but those resources were running out, and we were running up against the Sundance deadline, and we felt that we had a responsibility to include that in the story, so we had to figure out very quickly how to incorporate that into the film and make some changes.
If you missed any of our shows, you can watch them on our YouTube channel or on our website, kamlashow.com. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back again next week with another edition of our show.